Joseph Rourke had exactly 2 rules that he lived by, and every man from Abilene to the Rio Grande knew it. He did not get tangled up with women, and he never made a promise he could not keep. Both rules were gone before supper on the 14th of September, 1873. He had not intended to be in Dusty Creek at all that day. The town sat like a scab on the edge of the Texas panhandle, a collection of weathered plank buildings huddled together against the relentless wind, as though they were afraid to stand alone. Joseph had ridden through it a dozen times over the past 3 years, and had never once slowed his horse to more than a trot. He had freight to move north, a contract with a cattle outfit outside of Amarillo that paid well and asked no questions about his past, and that was the life he had carved for himself since leaving Missouri. Clean, solitary, uncomplicated. The trouble started at the water trough on the south end of Main Street. He had pulled his horse, a dusty roan gelding he called Cinder, up to the trough, and was standing there letting the animal drink when he heard the argument spilling out of the general store beside him. He would have ignored it entirely. Arguments in frontier towns were as common as flies and twice as persistent, except the voice arguing back was a woman's, and it had a particular quality to it. Not shrill, not frightened. It was the voice of someone who was fighting with everything she had and was not going to stop. Joseph turned despite himself. Through the open door of Harlan's general store he could see her clearly. She stood with her back straight and her chin lifted, and she looked like she had been arguing for a good while already. She was perhaps 23 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid that had come half undone from the ride or the struggle or both, and she wore a plain blue dress that had seen considerable travel. The man across the counter from her was Silas Harlan, who was roughly the shape of a barrel and had the temperament of a cornered badger, and he was currently holding a sheaf of papers in his hand and shaking them at her like a rattlesnake's tail. "The deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on," Silas was saying, his face red enough to suggest he might be unwell. "Your uncle owed 3 months' credit to this store and 2 months' back rent to the land company, and there is nothing left, Miss Keating. Nothing. The property has been absorbed against the debts. The property was left to me by my uncle in a legal will," the woman, Miss Keating, said, and her voice did not waver. "Signed and witnessed. You cannot simply take it because he owed you money. That is not how the law works." "The law around here works however I say it works," Silas told her, and his voice had dropped into something uglier. "Your uncle is dead, sweetheart, and you have been traveling for 2 weeks to get here from wherever you came from, and all you have found at the end of your journey is a lot of nothing. I suggest you take the next stage east and go home." "I do not have an east to go back to," she said. "My uncle's farm is my home now. I intend to work it." Joseph was already moving toward the door before he had fully decided to. He told himself later, lying in his bedroll under the stars, that he had gone in because Silas Harlan was a known cheat, and he disliked cheats on principle. That was partly true. What was more true was something he refused to examine too closely, which was that the way Annie Keating stood in that store utterly alone, utterly outgunned, and utterly refusing to yield, had hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a thrown stone. He stepped through the door and Silas looked up with the expression of a man interrupted mid-victory. "Rourke," Silas said flatly. "Harlan," Joseph said. He walked to the counter and stood beside Annie Keating, and he did not look at her, only at Silas. "I couldn't help overhearing. Sounded like you were explaining property law to this lady." "This doesn't concern you," Silas said. "Maybe not," Joseph said. "But I happen to know Judge Elias Pryor is riding circuit this month, and he passed through Callahan's Crossing 4 days ago. He ought to be in Dusty Creek by end of week. Might be the lady would want to lay her deed before him and let him have a look." The color in Silas's face shifted. Judge Pryor was a man of particular reputation, the kind that made dishonest men uncomfortable in their boots. "She can do whatever she pleases," Silas said, but the bluster had gone out of him the way air goes out of a punctured bag. "Good," Joseph said. I'm glad we're in agreement." He turned then, and he looked at Annie Keating for the first time properly, and it was a mistake he recognized the moment it happened, because she was looking back at him with amber-colored eyes that seemed to hold entire weather systems inside them, storm and sun both, and she was not saying thank you, not yet. She was just looking at him with an expression he could not immediately name, but that settled somewhere in his chest and did not leave. "I had that handled," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I could see that, but I suppose you helped anyway." "Habit," he said, and moved toward the door. "Wait," she said. He stopped. He should not have stopped. "My name is Annie Keating," she said. "My uncle was Earl Keating. He had a farm about 4 miles east of here, and if what that man says is even partly true, I may need someone who knows the area to help me understand what I'm actually dealing with. I can pay." "I'm not a lawyer," he said. "I didn't ask for a lawyer," she said. "I asked for someone who knows the area." He looked at her for a long moment, and his first rule, the one about women, was already making uncomfortable noises in the back of his head. He thought about his freight contract. He thought about Amarillo. He thought about the clean, uncomplicated life he had been perfectly happy living. "My name is Joseph Rourke," he said. "I have freight to move north by the 21st. "That gives us a week," she said. "I didn't agree to anything," he said. "No," she said, "but you will." And God help him, she was right. The town of Dusty Creek in September of 1873 was not quite the lawless territory it had been a decade earlier, but neither was it what anyone could honestly call civilized. The Texas frontier was still very much in the process of becoming something, caught between what it had been open range, Comanche territory, a place where a man or woman's chances depended entirely on their own strength and luck, and what it was slowly becoming as the railroads pushed west, and the cattle drives churned north, and the homesteaders arrived with their plows and their optimism and their terrifying belief that the land could be tamed. Annie Keating was precisely this kind of optimist, and Joseph Rourke was precisely the kind of man who had watched enough optimism die in the Texas dust to have given up on the quality entirely. He found this out on the ride to Earl Keating's farm. She sat a horse well, he noticed, not with the ease of someone who had grown up riding, but with the careful competence of someone who had learned and taken it seriously. Her horse was a small chestnut mare she called Pepper, and she handled the animal with quiet authority. "You're not from Texas," he said. He was not sure why he said it. He had not intended to make conversation. "Illinois," she said. "Bloomington. My father died 2 years ago and my mother the year before that. My uncle Earl was the only family I had left, and he wrote to tell me about the farm and said if I ever needed a place to go, it was mine." She paused. "He died in July. Heart gave out, they say. I received the letter about the will in August, and I started west the following week." "You came alone," he said. "There was no one to come with me," she said simply. He digested this. A young woman traveling from Illinois to the Texas panhandle alone in 1873 was not merely brave. It was the kind of undertaking that required either enormous courage or an equally enormous lack of appreciation for the dangers involved. He was beginning to suspect she possessed both qualities in equal measure. "What do you know about farming?" he asked. "Enough," she said. "My father kept a small farm outside Bloomington. I know hard work." "Texas farming is not Illinois farming," he said. "I'll learn," she said. He almost said something sharp about the 100 ways the panhandle had killed people who had said exactly that, but something stopped him. The way she said it, perhaps, not naively, not as though she believed it would be easy, more as though she had already accepted it would be hard and had decided that didn't matter. The farm, when they reached it, was in the condition that 2 months of abandonment and a summer of Texas wind and heat will produce, which is to say it looked like it was considering collapsing, but had not quite committed to it yet. The house was a low structure of rough-cut timber and sod, the kind that Earl Keating had probably built himself with whatever materials were at hand. The roof had shed some shingles. The small garden plot had gone entirely to weeds and hard earth. The well looked functional. There was a lean-to barn that contained nothing except old straw and a broken harrow. Annie stood in the doorway and looked at all of it, and Joseph stood a few feet behind her and watched her face. She took in the cracked boards, the dust, the smell of long vacancy. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were doing something complicated. "It's worse than I expected," she said. "Yes," he said. There seemed no kindness in lying about it. "But the structure is sound," she said. "The walls are solid. The well is good. I can see by the rope that someone's used it recently. The barn could be repaired." She turned to look at him and her chin was up again. "It's workable." "It is," he said, and meant it. He had seen less promising starts succeed. "I need to see the deed papers against whatever Harlan is claiming," she said. "And I need to know who holds the land company mortgage and whether my uncle's debts can actually be attached to the property itself or whether they were personal debts that die with him." He looked at her. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've thought about very little else for 2 weeks," she said. He found himself almost smiling, which was unusual enough that he made himself stop. "The land company Harlan mentioned is probably Denton and Marsh," he said. "They've been buying up defaulted properties across this stretch of the panhandle for 2 years. They're not exactly honest men." "Of course they're not," she said, without particular surprise. "Their representative in Dusty Creek is a man named Frank Calder," he said. "He's been known to use pressure to get people off land they're entitled to. Nothing you could easily prove, but the pressure is there." She nodded slowly. "And Judge Pryor, honest as they come," he said. "Which is exactly why Harlan went pale when I mentioned him." "Then we need to hold the property until Pryor arrives," she said. "Can we do that?" He noticed she said "we" and told himself it meant nothing. "Stay here tonight," he said. "I'll ride back to town and send word ahead to Pryor's circuit so he knows to come here first, and I'll have a look at Harlan's claim documentation. He'll have filed something if he means to make it legal." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. It was a fair question and he did not have a satisfying answer for it. "Because Harlan is a cheat," he said. "And because Judge Pryor is a friend of mine and pointing him toward dishonesty takes no effort." She studied him the way a person studies something they are not sure they have correctly identified. "That's a practical reason," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said. She almost smiled. "All right, Mr. Rourke," she said. "I'll be here." He rode back to Dusty Creek with the particular awareness of a man who knows he has stepped onto ground that is not entirely solid, but has not yet figured out how to step back off it. He sent the wire to Pryor's circuit office in Callahan's Crossing through the telegraph office beside the post station, kept by a thin man named Peters who was reliably discreet for a modest sum. Then he went to the county record office, a single dusty room attached to the back of the sheriff's station, and spent 2 hours going through the filed documents on Earl Keating's property. What he found was instructive. Silas Harlan had filed a lien against the property for the store credit, which was legitimate enough in isolation. But the Denton and Marsh filing was something else entirely. The mortgage document had been recorded as falling due in June of 1873, the same month Earl Keating had died, and the due date had been backdated. Joseph could not prove it was fraudulent without a handwriting expert or access to the original instrument. But the date had a quality to it, a freshness in the ink, a slight variation in the paper, that told him someone had been busy. He took careful notes on everything. On his way out, he ran into Tom Garrett, who was the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a sheriff in the conventional sense. Officially, he was a county deputy. Practically, he was the law for 30 miles in any direction. Tom was a solid man of 50, weathered to leather with a reputation for fairness that Joseph respected. "Heard you got involved in the Keating business," Tom said, leaning against the doorframe. "Somewhat," Joseph said. "You know Frank Calder is going to hear about it," Tom said. "He doesn't let go of property once he's decided it's his." "I know," Joseph said. "Pryor's riding circuit this month." Tom Garrett's expression shifted. "Is he now?" he said. "Should be here by week's end," Joseph said. Tom was quiet for a moment. "The woman's got a solid deed." As solid as you can get, Joseph said, and Denton and Marsh's paperwork smells like fresh ink on old paper. Tom nodded slowly. I'll keep that in mind, he said. Joseph rode back to the Keating farm with the last of the daylight turning the panhandle sky into something that looked painted. The light out here was one of the things he had never quite gotten used to, even after 3 years. The way it went from brutal white glare to this extraordinary layering of orange and rose and purple, as though the sky was apologizing for all the punishment it had delivered during the day. He found Annie behind the house, hauling water from the well with a calm efficiency that told him she had already made herself entirely at home. She had tied her horse in the lean-to and found some dry feed for her, had swept out the main room of the house and opened the single small window, and had located from somewhere in the trunk she had brought with her a small tin coffee pot and the makings of a fire. The document situation, she said when he told her what he had found. Harlan's lien is real, he said. But it's a personal debt of your uncle's, not a property encumbrance, and under Texas law it doesn't automatically transfer to an heir. A judge would have to rule on it, and a judge who's not in Harlan's pocket would likely dismiss it or require settlement from the estate rather than seizure of the property. And the land company mortgage. That one concerns me more, he said. The date is wrong. I think they backdated the due date to put it in default before your uncle died, which would give them a cleaner claim. But if Pryor looks at the original instrument alongside the filed copy, they won't match, she said. Probably not, he said. She poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to him with the automatic ease of someone who considers offering coffee to be no particular kind of intimacy, just courtesy, and Joseph took it before his first rule could register an objection. How long have you been doing this? She asked. Freighting. 3 years, he said. Before that. He was quiet for a moment. Missouri, he said. I had a farm. She waited. It didn't work out, he said. It was the most compressed possible version of a story that had taken him the better part of a year to survive, and he did not intend to expand upon it. But something about her stillness, the way she simply waited without pressing or filling the silence with social noise, made him say more than he intended to. My wife died, fever, 1870. I sold the farm and moved west. I'm sorry, she said, not with the overdone condolence that he had learned to expect, the kind that made him feel like a subject of general concern rather than a person. Just 2 words, said clearly and honestly. Thank you, he said, and meant it in the same honest way. They sat on the hard ground outside the door of the low house with the last of the Texas light dying around them and drank their coffee, and listened to the coyote starting up somewhere out on the plain. And Joseph Rourke became aware that he could not remember the last time he had sat still with another person, and felt no urge whatsoever to leave. The next 2 days were practical and busy, and somehow the most alive he had felt in years. Annie attacked the farm with a methodical energy that impressed him in spite of himself. She was not the sort of woman who waited for circumstances to improve. She improved them. She cleaned the house from threshold to rafters, rehung the door that had been sagging off its top hinge, repaired the shutter that had been banging loose in the wind, and reorganized the outbuildings with a calm thoroughness that suggested she had been planning exactly this for every day of her 2-week journey. Joseph found himself stopping in more and more often rather than actually leaving, which he kept meaning to do. He repaired the roof on the lean-to barn with some shingles he had purchased in town. He looked at the well structure and reinforced the coping. He rode the property lines with her and helped her understand what she had 160 acres, of which perhaps 60 were genuinely workable for grain crops, the rest being suitable for grazing if she could get animals. You do better with cattle than crops out here, he told her, standing on a low rise that looked across the brownish-golden grass of the panhandle. The soil's too alkaline for most grain, but the grass, poor as it looks, is actually decent forage. A small herd, 50, 60 head, managed well. I don't know cattle, she said. You'd learn, he said, and heard his own words echo back at him with a particular irony. She had said the same thing to him about farming. She looked at him sideways, and that almost smile was back. "Now who's the optimist?" she said. "I know the difference between a dream and a workable plan," he said. "A small cattle operation on this land is a workable plan." She turned and looked across the grass, and he could see her doing what she did, taking information in, running it against reality, deciding what to build. "I'd need capital to start," she said. "I'd need to secure the land first and then, one problem at a time," he said. She nodded. "One problem at a time," she agreed. That was Wednesday. On Thursday, Frank Calder rode out to the farm. Calder was not what Joseph had expected, and he suspected Annie had expected worse too, because for a moment she gave away surprise before composing herself. Frank Calder was a trim, well-dressed man of perhaps 40, with the groomed appearance of someone who came from Eastern money and had brought it west. He wore a good suit instead of range clothes, and he rode a beautiful gray horse that cost more than most people in Dusty Creek earned in a year. He had pleasant manners and a pleasant face, and his eyes were the temperature of a mountain stream in February. He removed his hat when he came to the door, and he addressed Annie with complete courtesy. "Miss Keating," he said. "I'm Frank Calder, representing Denton and Marsh Land Holdings. I understand you've arrived to take possession of your uncle's property." "I have," Annie said. She stood in the doorway. Joseph was visible behind her, leaning against the wall inside. Calder's eyes moved to Joseph and registered him. "Mr. Rourke," he said pleasantly. "Calder," Joseph said. "I wanted to come myself," Calder said, returning his attention to Annie, "to explain the situation clearly and without any misunderstanding. Your uncle held a mortgage with our company against this land. The mortgage fell due in June of this year and was not serviced at that time. Under the terms of the mortgage instrument, the property reverts to the holding company following 60 days of default. We are now in September, Miss Keating. The 60 days has long passed. The mortgage document filed with the county shows a due date of June 1st, Annie said. My uncle's letters to me, which I still have, reference a mortgage on this property with a due date of December 1st. December 1st of 1873. Something moved through Calder's pleasant expression, too quickly for Joseph to classify it precisely, but it was there. "Letters can be misread," he said, "or misremembered." "I have the letters with me," Annie said. 6 of them over the past 2 years, all of which reference the December date. "Miss Keating," Calder said, and now some of the pleasantness was becoming something else underneath, "I would strongly encourage you to think carefully about your situation. You are a woman alone in a part of the country that is not particularly hospitable. Making enemies of men who could be allies seems—" "She's not alone," Joseph said. He had not moved from the wall, and his voice was entirely level. "And Judge Pryor arrives in Dusty Creek by Saturday. I imagine he'll be very interested in the original mortgage instrument compared against the filed copy." The silence that followed had its own particular temperature. "Saturday," Calder said. "Saturday," Joseph said. Calder put his hat back on his head with the care of a man reordering his thoughts. "Good day, Miss Keating," he said with perfect courtesy that had entirely stopped reaching his eyes. "Mr. Rourke." He turned his gray horse and rode. Annie let out a long breath. "He'll do something before Saturday," she said. "Yes," Joseph said. "He will." "What?" Joseph was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. "He'll try to get the original mortgage instrument out of the county records before Pryor can see it," he said. "Which means Tom Garrett needs to know right now that that document has to stay exactly where it is." "Can Garrett do that?" she asked. "Yes," Joseph said, "because if I tell him about the backdating, he'll understand what he's protecting and why." He rode to town within the hour. Tom Garrett listened to the full account with the expression of a man absorbing information he has already half suspected. "The original instrument," Tom said. "It's in the vault file in the record room." "Can you put your deputy on the record room until Pryor arrives?" Joseph asked. "I can do better than that," Tom said. "I can go pull the document myself right now and hold it in my personal custody as evidence of potential fraud. That's within my authority as county deputy." "That's exactly what needs to happen," Joseph said. Tom stood. "Rourke," he said, "I know you've kept your distance from Dusty Creek affairs these past years. I've appreciated that you came in now." Joseph said nothing because he was not entirely sure what to say. He had kept his distance from Dusty Creek affairs because he had kept his distance from everything. And the fact that he was currently in the middle of something that was going to require him to be present and engaged and accountable for the next several days was unsettling in a way he could not fully identify but could feel everywhere. He knew it was Annie Keating. He knew it the way you know when weather is changing, not by looking up at the sky, but by feeling something in the air around you shift. He stayed that night at the farm. He told himself it was because he needed to be present if Calder tried something before morning. This was true. It was not the only truth. Annie made supper salt pork and beans and cornbread cooked over the fire in a cast iron skillet she had apparently decided was staying since it was among Earl Keating's remaining possessions, and they ate at the small, rough table inside the house and talked. Not about the land company or the deed or the judge. Just talked. She told him about growing up in Bloomington, about her father's orchard and how she had loved the apple harvest as a child, about her mother who had been a school teacher and had insisted on reading aloud in the evenings, Shakespeare and Dickens and the King James Bible. He told her about Missouri, not the grief parts those still lived too deep to surface easily, but the farm itself, the river bottomland, the particular richness of that dark soil compared to the panhandle's hard clay. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Missouri," he thought about it honestly. "I miss the idea of it," he said. "What I thought it was going to be. The actual place, I don't know if I could go back to it now." "Because of your wife," she said, not a question. "Because of myself," he said, which surprised him because he had not quite put it that way before. "I'm not the same person who lived there." She was quiet, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "I think that's brave," she said. "What is?" "Knowing that," she said. "A lot of people spend their whole lives being someone they already stopped being." He looked at her across the table in the firelight, and she was entirely matter-of-fact, not sentimental about it, not performing wisdom, just saying what she thought. It hit him with the same force as everything else about her, the same solid, quiet, irresistible force. His first rule was now making no noise at all, which was considerably worse than when it had been making noise. He made himself look away. "You should get some sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch from outside." "Joseph," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. She looked slightly surprised at herself. "Mr. Rourke," she corrected. "Joseph is fine," he said. And then, because he was apparently determined to do everything wrong this week, "You can call me Joseph." "Joseph, then," she said. "You don't have to sleep outside. There's a second room. It was probably my uncle's and it needs cleaning, but there's a rope bed frame." "I'll manage outside," he said. "It's going to be 40 degrees by midnight," she said. "I've slept in worse." She looked at him with those amber eyes, and the look had something new in it, something patient and slightly amused, and also something considerably more serious underneath both. "You don't have to keep your distance from me," she said. "I'm not asking anything of you beyond the help you've already given." It was the exact right thing to say and the exact wrong thing at the same time, because it made him feel the distance he was keeping as a thing he had chosen rather than a thing he required, and feeling the choice made it harder. "I'll be fine outside," he said. He slept under the stars, and it was indeed 40 degrees, and he was awake half the night, which gave him a great deal of time to think about things he had been successfully not thinking about for 3 years. Judge Elias Pryor arrived in Dusty Creek on Friday afternoon, 1 day earlier than expected. Joseph met him on the main street, where Pryor was dismounting a dark bay horse with the slightly stiff movements of a man who had been in the saddle for 4 days and knew exactly which joints would complain about it tomorrow. Pryor was 61 years old, broad-shouldered and white-haired, with a face that had spent 6 decades developing an expression of complete impartiality that somehow still managed to suggest he was on the side of right. He had been a circuit judge for 15 years, and before that a lawyer in Austin, and before that though he never mentioned it, a scout in the Mexican War. He shook Joseph's hand with the grip of a man 20 years younger. "Your wire was extremely interesting," Pryor said. "Backdated mortgage instrument and a land company pressuring a lone woman off valid property. That is a story I am professionally delighted to examine." "I knew you would be," Joseph said. "And the woman in question?" "Her name is Annie Keating," Joseph said. "She came from Illinois." He stopped. Pryor looked at him with the particular attention of a man who has spent decades reading people in courtrooms. "She's what?" he said mildly. "Capable," Joseph said. "She'll present her own case clearly." "I have no doubt," Pryor said, and something in his expression was unreadably amused. They held the hearing the following morning in the main room of the Dusty Creek Courthouse, which was a generous name for a large room attached to the back of the sheriff's office. But it had a table at one end that served as a bench, and Tom Garrett's deputy had hung an American flag on the wall. And Judge Pryor sat at the table in his long black coat, and the proceedings had all the authority of any federal courthouse. Annie Keating presented her case with a composure and clarity that made Joseph deeply and inexplicably proud, which was a feeling he had no right to, and acknowledged to no one. She laid out the 6 letters from Earl Keating, with the December mortgage date clearly referenced in each. Tom Garrett presented the original mortgage instrument from his custody, and alongside it the filed county copy, and even from across the room the difference in ink color and paper wear was visible. Frank Calder had brought a lawyer from Amarillo, a smooth-talking man named Whitfield, who attempted to argue that the original document had simply been damaged by water and re-inked for legibility. Judge Pryor listened to this argument with the expression of a man listening to a mediocre musician play a tune he has heard too many times. "The re-inking theory," Pryor said, "would require that the re-inking also altered the text of the due date, since the reference date in the original instrument is December 1st and the filed copy reads June 1st. I am to understand water and re-inking change the number 6 to the number 12 and the word June to the word December." Whitfield had no satisfying answer for this. Silas Harlan's lien claim Pryor disposed of in roughly 4 minutes, confirming what Joseph had believed. It was a personal debt of Earl Keating's estate, and did not constitute a valid claim against the property itself. Any recovery of the debt would have to come from the estate's assets, of which there were very few. The ruling took an hour to issue, and it was complete and unambiguous. Annie Keating owned the 160 acres, free and clear, with the Denton and Marsh mortgage instrument ruled fraudulent and void, and Pryor made additional notations recommending that the firm's land practices across the county be examined further by the appropriate authorities. Annie came out of the courthouse into the September morning and stood for a moment with her eyes closed and her face turned up to the sun, and Joseph stood a few feet away and watched her and did not say anything, because some moments do not require words, and this was one of them. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him, and the expression on her face undid something in him that had been tied down for 3 years. "Thank you," she said. "Joseph." He did not say "you're welcome," which would have been the appropriate and distant thing to say. What he said was, "You were extraordinary in there." She blinked, as though the directness of it surprised her. "I just told the truth," she said. "In front of a judge and a company lawyer and a hostile crowd," he said. "Yes, that's what I mean." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Are you leaving today?" she said. "For Amarillo, his freight contract." He had not thought about it in 2 days, which was remarkable and also telling. "I should," he said. "Should is not the same as are," she said. No, it was not. "Annie," he said. She waited. "I have a rule," he said, "about women." He felt the absurdity of saying it even as he said it, because the rule was already beyond breaking. It had been broken somewhere between the general store and the first cup of coffee, and probably before that, probably the moment she had looked at him with those amber eyes and said, "I had that handled." "I know," she said. "You don't get involved." "How do you know that?" he said. "Because it's written all over you," she said. "Every time you start to say something and then don't. Every time you take yourself outside in the cold. Every time you look at me, and then deliberately look somewhere else." She was completely direct, standing in the morning sun, and there was no cruelty in it, only honesty. "I'm not asking you to change your rule, Joseph. I'm asking if you'd like to stay for supper." He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. "I also have a rule about promises," he said. "I don't make them if I can't keep them." "I know that too," she said. "If I stay for supper," he said carefully, "I'm going to want to come back." "I know," she said. "And if I come back," he said, "I don't know how to. I haven't done this since." He stopped. "I know," she said again, gently this time, as though she was offering him the words he couldn't find. "But Joseph, I'm not asking you to know. I'm asking you to try." He looked at the clear September sky and the dust of Main Street and the low line of the panhandle reaching away in every direction toward a horizon that seemed both limitless and terrifying. And then he looked at Annie Keating. "Both rules," he said. "Gone before supper." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a genuine, full laugh, not the polite and social kind, but the real kind that comes from the body. And it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in years. And he was done then, entirely done, and he let himself know it. "I'll wire Amarillo," he said. "Tell them I'll be delayed a week." "A week," she said. "We'll see after that," he said. She smiled, not the almost smile, the real one, and it was exactly as devastating as he had suspected it would be. He wired Amarillo. He stayed for supper. He came back the day after that, and the day after that, and by the end of the second week he had written to the freight company with a more comprehensive explanation of his delay that he was not sure he could fully explain in business terms. The days had a rhythm to them that he found himself fitting into, with a naturalness that startled him. He was handy with wood and with mechanical things, and the farm had an inexhaustible supply of things that needed fixing, which gave him a reason to be present that did not require him to examine the larger reason he was present. He rebuilt the Linta barn properly. He repaired the well coping and fashioned a better pulley system. He rode the fence lines and identified where new posts were needed and spent 2 days sinking them. Annie, meanwhile, was methodically transforming the house from a habitable shell into something that resembled a home. She had discovered that a woman in Dusty Creek who could sew was a woman who could trade for goods and services, and she set herself up very quietly as a seamstress with 3 regular clients within her first week, which brought in enough to cover immediate needs while she planned the longer term. She was also talking to every rancher who came through town about small cattle. He discovered this when he rode back from the fence work one afternoon and found her in serious conversation with an older rancher named Dale Hutter, who ran a modest operation about 10 miles south. Hutter was a dry-spoken man of 60 who was not easy to impress, and he was currently looking at Annie Keating with the expression of a man who has been impressed against his expectations. "She's asking smart questions," Hutter told Joseph after Annie had gone inside. He said it with the tone of a man remarking on weather. "Not the questions a newcomer asks, the questions a rancher asks." "She's a fast learner," Joseph said. Hutter gave him a look. "She's more than that," he said. "You know that." Joseph did not answer this. But he went inside, and Annie was at the table with a piece of paper covered in figures, and she looked up at him with her eyes bright and said, "Dale Hutter has 12 heifers he's willing to sell for a fair price and take payment over 2 seasons. 12 heifers properly bred could be 30 cattle in 3 years. 24, he said, if you have good survival rates and normal births." "All right, 24, she said. "With the grazing on the east field, you'd need a bull," he said. "Hutter says he'll let me use his for a breeding fee," she said. Joseph sat down across the table from her and looked at her figures, and they were, in fact, impressively sound. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "Since you told me about the grass," she said. "On the low rise, do you remember?" He remembered everything. He was trying to remember fewer things, but it was not working. "It's a good plan," he said. She looked at him over her papers. "Are you going to tell me why you're still here?" she said. "Probably not today," he said. She accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most things and went back to her figures, and he sat across from her and helped her refine the numbers. And by the time the light had shifted to evening, they had worked out a plan that was genuinely viable, and he felt an uncomplicated joy in that, in the working of a problem together, in the fit of two minds approaching the same question from different directions, and arriving somewhere better than either would have alone. The evening was soft and cool, the wind gentled to a breath, and they sat outside afterward with coffee as had become their habit, and Annie set down her cup and looked at the sky and said, very quietly, "My mother used to say that home is not a place, it's a feeling. I never understood what she meant until I came here." He looked at her profile against the fading sky. "I feel it," she said, "even though everything is hard and uncertain and I don't know what half of next year looks like. I feel like I'm exactly where I should be." "I know that feeling," he said, and then, with more honesty than he had intended to offer, "I haven't felt it in a long time." She turned to look at him. "I feel it now," he said. He held her gaze. "Here." She went very still. The coyotes were starting on the plain, and the first stars were appearing in the east, and the fire behind them was settling to coals, and Joseph Rourke sat in the warm quiet of this woman's presence and felt the world that had been gray for 3 years beginning to show color again, cautiously, the way color comes back in the morning slowly from the edges in. "Joseph," she said. "I know," he said. "I know I haven't said it plainly." "No," she agreed. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I was better at it once before." He paused. "I'm trying to remember how." "You don't have to be good at it," she said. "You just have to be honest about it." He looked at his hands, at hers, at the distance between them that had been getting smaller every day in ways that had nothing to do with physical space. "I don't want to leave," he said. "When I think about Amarillo and the freight contracts and the road, none of it feels like anything. And then I think about being here and everything feels like something again." "That is saying it plainly," she said softly. He raised his eyes to hers. "I know I said 1 week," he said. "And I know I'm still here, and I don't know exactly what that means going forward or what I can offer or—" "Joseph," she said. "Stop cataloging what you can't give me and just tell me what you want." He was quiet for a long moment, and then the rule, the one about promises, did something it had never done before, which was step aside, not because it was meaningless but because keeping it no longer required the silence it had required for 3 years. Keeping it now required the opposite. "I want to stay," he said. "Not for a week. I'd like to be part of this, Annie, the farm, the cattle plan. Whatever you're building here, I want to help build it." She was looking at him very steadily. "Is that all you want?" she said. "No," he said. The single word landed between them with the weight of everything he had been not saying for 2 weeks. She reached across the distance between them and put her hand over his, just resting it there, and did not say anything, and did not need to. He turned his hand over and held hers. That was October. The world was shifting from the brutal heat of summer to the complicated beauty of the Texas fall, with its weeks of crystal air and its sudden violent storms and its long, aching sunsets that seemed to last forever. Joseph sent a formal notice to the freight company in Amarillo dissolving his contract, which cost him a penalty he could afford, and which he did not think about twice. He had some money saved, not a great deal, but enough to be useful, and he offered it to Annie not as charity but as a partnership proposition, which she accepted after thinking about it for a day in the serious, thorough way she thought about everything. He did not move into the house. He built himself a small shelter in the lean-to barn, which was now weather-tight and comfortable, and he slept there, and Annie slept in the house, and the distance between them was both modest and significant, and they both understood that it mattered that it existed, for now. He wanted things done properly. He wanted, when he made any promises, the second rule, the one he had been living by so carefully, to make them ones he was completely certain of. He was entirely certain. He waited another week, because certainty and readiness are not the same thing, and he spent that week in a sustained state of happiness that surprised him by its quality. It was not the manic happiness of someone who has been lonely a long time and suddenly is not. It was quieter than that, and warmer, like the return of circulation to a limb that had gone numb. Everything was vivid again. The smell of the grass, the particular sound of Cinder's hooves on the hard earth. Annie's voice from inside the house in the morning when she was talking to Pepper through the open window. The way the coffee tasted after a hard hour's work. Ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously. On a Tuesday in mid-October, with a cold front coming in from the north and the sky going to pewter, he came in from the fence line and found Annie at the table doing her accounts, and he stood in the doorway and said, "Annie." She looked up. He crossed the room and he did not go around the table. He came to where she sat and he held out his hand, and she looked at it and then at his face, and she stood up. And he said, "I want to say something carefully, because I mean it very precisely." "All right," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I don't say that lightly. I know what it means, and I've thought about it for 2 weeks, and I am certain. And I would like to ask you something, but I want to make sure you know that first, that it's the truth, and it's not said out of circumstance or gratitude or anything except that I love you." She was completely still. "I know it's fast," he said. "I know 6 weeks is not very long. But I also know what I feel, and I've never been someone who can feel things without knowing them for what they are." "Joseph," she said, and her voice had something in it he had never heard before, something that made his heart turn over. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "If you'd have me, I'd like to build this with you, all of it, whatever comes next." The cold front reached the farm at that moment, sending a gust of wind through the open window that scattered some of Annie's papers across the floor, and neither of them looked at the papers. Annie Keating, who had traveled alone from Illinois to the Texas panhandle, who had faced Silas Harlan and Frank Calder without flinching, who had planned a cattle operation from scratch and executed it with more competence than most people twice her age. Annie Keating put both her hands against Joseph Rourke's chest and looked at him and said, "I've been in love with you since you walked into that store and didn't look at Harlan like he was a problem to be managed, but like he was a dishonest man who ought to be ashamed of himself, which is a very specific thing to notice about someone, and I noticed it immediately." He laughed. He had not really laughed, from the middle of himself in a very long time, and it felt extraordinary. "That's a yes," she said. "I gathered," he said, and he kissed her, there in the kitchen of the little panhandle house with the cold wind coming through the window and the papers all over the floor, and it was the best thing that had happened to him in 3 years, and possibly, he admitted to himself while it was happening, in considerably longer than that. They were married in November by Reverend Collies of the Dusty Creek Methodist Church, which was only slightly larger than a well-maintained chicken house, but had a real wooden floor and a bell, which Annie considered important. Judge Pryor, who was on his way back east after completing his circuit and had made a point of coming through Dusty Creek again specifically for this occasion, stood as a witness. Tom Garrett was there. Dale Hutter was there, looking as though someone had polished him unexpectedly, and he was unsure how to respond. A handful of women from town who had become, in the manner of small frontier communities, almost involuntarily fond of Annie, came and brought food and considerable warm feeling. Annie wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with blue embroidery at the cuffs and collar, and when she came through the door of the church and Joseph saw her, the emotion that went through him was so sharp it was almost indistinguishable from pain. Reverend Collies was a round, earnest man who conducted the ceremony with genuine feeling, and when he reached the part about the promises, the vows, he looked at Joseph with the particular attention of a man who has heard many people say these words, and can tell the difference between those who are saying them as a form and those who are saying them as the deepest truth they know. Joseph said them as the deepest truth he knew. Annie said them back to him with her eyes on his face and her hands steady in his, and if the old rule about promises was gone, the rule about not making ones he couldn't keep, it was gone because what replaced it was stronger. Not a rule, a knowledge. He would keep these promises. He would keep them every day for as long as he had days. The winter that followed was hard in the way Texas Panhandle winters are hard, which is to say it was not always dramatic, but it was always relentless. The cold settled in like an uninvited guest who had decided to stay until spring. The work was constant. The cattle, all 12 of Hutter's heifers, delivered in late October, required daily attention, and Joseph and Annie divided the work with the practical efficiency of two people who know each other well enough to fit around each other's rhythms without discussion. But the winter was also beautiful. The way she learned the animals, naming them with a quiet certainty that suggested she had been naming cattle her whole life. The way she kept accounts with a precision that would have shamed most businesses in the county. The evenings by the fire with books, she had brought a good collection from Illinois, and Judge Pryor had sent more as a wedding gift. When she read aloud in her clear voice, and he sat beside her and was aware of being, in some uncomplicated and profound way, home. He had forgotten what it felt like to be home. He had lost it in Missouri, and he had not expected to find it again, certainly not here, certainly not like this. But there it was, every morning when she was the first thing he heard, and every night when she was the last thing he saw. He told her this, one evening in February when the wind was howling outside and the fire was high, and she was beside him on the narrow settee that she had acquired through an improbably successful trade involving a particularly beautiful tablecloth she had made, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know what I think?" "What?" he said. "I think home follows people who deserve it," she said. "I think it found you again because you were ready for it." He was quiet for a moment. "Did it find you?" he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It did," she said. "Here, exactly here." Spring came in March with the exuberance the Panhandle reserves for the season after its brutal winters, and the grass came up green and the first calves arrived, and of the 12 heifers they lost none, which Dale Hutter told them was an exceptional outcome and suggested they had been doing something right. The calves were 12, 8 females and 4 males, and the operation was growing as planned. Joseph had by this point become a genuinely useful and knowledgeable cattle man, not because he had a background in it, but because he had approached the learning with the same seriousness he applied to everything. He read everything he could find on the subject, which was more than might be expected given that range management practices in 1870s Texas were being developed in real time by the ranchers who were living them. He talked to every experienced rancher he could reach, including Dale Hutter, who had become a friend in the dry, understated way of men who respect each other's competence without needing to say so frequently. Annie was 4 months pregnant by the time the calves arrived. They had not told anyone yet, not because they were keeping it secret, but because the Panhandle custom of the time was a certain privacy in these things, an acknowledgement that pregnancies were uncertain, and the land was hard, and not everything needed to be announced before it could be depended upon. But she told Joseph in the kitchen on a morning in late November, sitting across the table with her hands around a coffee cup, and the look on his face made her laugh and then cry a little, both at the same time. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and put his hands over hers and said nothing for a long moment, just felt the moment the way you feel a moment you know you will keep for the rest of your life. "Are you all right?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone who has been awake since 4 in the morning because the smell of coffee became impossible," she said, "but otherwise entirely well." "I'll stop making coffee in the morning," he said immediately. "You will do no such thing," she said. "I'll manage, it'll pass." He stayed crouched beside her for another minute. "Annie," he said. "I know," she said. "I mean it," he said. "Whatever you need, everything." "I know," she said again, and kissed him on the forehead with the familiar, certain tenderness that had become the ground of their life together. "Go feed the heifers." He went and fed the heifers with the particular foolish joy of a man who has just been given news that has made the whole world larger. The baby came in July of 1874, in the same small house that had been a shell when Annie arrived, now made into something warm and real and theirs. He arrived on a hot afternoon with Hutter's wife Ruth in attendance. Ruth was the person the women of the surrounding area called upon for these occasions, having a calm competence in the matter that exceeded anything any of the doctors within 50 miles could offer, given that the nearest doctor was 40 miles south and of uncertain reliability. He was a boy, and he was healthy, and when Joseph held him for the first time in the hour after his birth, he was aware that something new had been added to the world that had not existed before, and the enormity of that simple fact hit him so cleanly and completely that he had to sit down. They named him Earl Joseph Rourke, for Annie's uncle, and for the man who had walked into a general store in Dusty Creek on a September afternoon and had his rules broken before supper. Dale Hutter, when informed of the name, was visibly moved and equally visibly determined not to show it, which resulted in him looking at the sky for a long time and then saying, gruffly, that it was a solid name for a boy who would grow up to know cattle. Joseph told Annie this story that evening while little Earl slept, and she laughed so hard she woke the baby, and Joseph had to walk him around the main room singing a Missouri folk song he only partly remembered, which was not dignified but was, he thought, exactly right. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because the panhandle was not a landscape that permitted ease, and the 1870s were not a decade that permitted many people anything resembling simplicity. The cattle markets fluctuated with the national economy, which was itself recovering uncertainly from the panic of 1873. There were bad droughts and good ones. There were winters that tested the animals and the people both. There were disputes with neighboring operations about fence lines and water rights, settled some by negotiation, some by Judge Pryor's continuing circuit visits, and one memorably by Tom Garrett, who arrived with enough legal authority and personal presence to cause the disputing party to reconsider his position very quickly. Frank Calder and Denton and Marsh had not disappeared entirely. Judge Pryor's recommendation had triggered an investigation that had taken 2 years to work through the slow machinery of 1870s Texas law, but it had eventually worked through, and the company's fraudulent practices had been prosecuted to the extent that the territory's legal infrastructure could manage, which meant Calder had left the county and Denton and Marsh had been required to relinquish several of the properties they had acquired under dubious circumstances and pay significant penalties. It was not perfect justice, but it was more than many had expected, and Annie, who had been called to give testimony about the backdated mortgage document, had done so with the same composure and clarity she brought to everything. Silas Harlan was still at his general store, still selling goods at questionable margins, but he had learned something from the autumn of 1873 about which battles were worth having. He was unfailingly polite to Annie whenever she came in, which was the best outcome anyone had realistically expected. Earl Joseph Rourke learned to walk in the spring of 1875, after considerable determined effort and several spectacular falls, none of which slowed him down. He was his mother's son in the matter of not being discouraged by obstacles. He was his father's son in the matter of silence. He observed everything with large amber eyes before deciding to respond to it, which Joseph found both familiar and extraordinary to witness in his child. Annie was expecting their second child by summer of 1875. This one came in February of 1876, in the middle of a Texas winter that had come in early and cold, and she was a girl dark-haired, immediately opinionated, with a set to her mouth from the first hour of her life that told Joseph she was going to be considerably like her mother, which was the best news he could have received. They named her Clara Me Rourke. By the spring of 1876, the Rourke operation had 38 head of cattle on the 160 acres, with a lease arrangement on an additional 40 acres to the east from a homesteader who had given up the land and returned to Nebraska. The house had been expanded. Joseph had built 2 additional rooms himself in the summer of 1875, proper framed rooms with wood floors, and was now, in every sense, the kind of house a family makes and means and cannot imagine leaving. Joseph Rourke, who had left Missouri as a man who had decided that solitude was the safest country available to him, had arrived somewhere better. He had arrived at a life. He thought about this sometimes on the early mornings before the children were up, when he was outside with the cattle, and the sky was still that particular pre-dawn blue that precedes the panhandle sunrise, and the land stretched out in every direction, and was silent except for the animals and the wind. He thought about the man he had been 3 years ago, riding through Dusty Creek without slowing Cinder to more than a trot, thinking he wanted nothing and had arranged his life accordingly. He thought about what it had cost to live like that, not dramatically, not in the way of tragedy, but in the slow daily erosion of someone who has stopped allowing anything to matter. And then Annie would call from inside the house, or Earl would come out the door in his nightshirt rubbing his eyes and heading for his father, or Clara would start up in the small voice she used in the very early morning, different from her louder afternoon voice, and the thinking would stop because there was no longer any mystery in it. He was here. He was glad. On a morning in September of 1876, 3 years, almost to the day, from the morning Joseph Rourke had first ridden through Dusty Creek, he came in from early cattle work and found Annie standing at the kitchen table looking at a letter. Earl was at the table eating breakfast with the determination of a 2-year-old who has established strong opinions about porridge. Clara was in the small wooden cradle near the window. "What is it?" he said. Annie looked up. "It's from Mrs. Eliza Farrow," she said. "In town. She's asking if I'd be willing to teach school." Dusty Creek had been talking about a school for a year. The population of the surrounding area had grown enough families settling, children needing education, that the need was undeniable. The problem had been finding someone willing and qualified to take it on. Annie's mother had been a school teacher. Annie could read Latin, could cipher well past anything the children of Dusty Creek would need for many years, and had, as every person who had spent any time with her knew, a way of explaining things that made them clear without making them simple. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him. "I want to do it," she said. "But it would mean the cattle." "I can manage the cattle," he said. "Earl's at the age where he can start helping with small things, and we could use a hand." "I've been thinking about it." "You haven't said anything," she said. "You've been busy having a child," he said. She laughed. "Joseph, I think you should do it," he said. "I think you'd be extraordinary at it, and I think those children need someone who can actually teach." She folded the letter and looked at him and then at Earl, who was looking back at them with the calm, observant expression of a child who knows something important is happening, but has not yet decided what role to play in it. "All right," she said. He hired a young hand named Cal Marsh, no relation to the land company, just a coincidence of names that made Annie laugh. A steady 20-year-old from a family in the county who knew cattle and was willing to learn more. Cal moved into the repaired barn with what Joseph had previously occupied before the wedding, and settled in with the easy adaptability of someone who has grown up working land and understands that a job worth keeping is a job worth doing well. Annie Keating Rourke began teaching at the Dusty Creek School in October of 1876, in a room that had been converted from the old feed storage behind the Methodist church, with 12 pupils ranging in age from 6 to 14, and a hand-painted slate board that Joseph had made for her over 2 evenings in the barn, while she was trying to pretend she wasn't watching him do it through the window. She was, as he had predicted, extraordinary. The parents noticed. Tom Garrett, who had a granddaughter among the students, told Joseph that the child had come home the first week talking about Illinois geography and the principles of long division with an enthusiasm that had not previously characterized her relationship with learning. Dale Hutter, who had a nephew enrolled, said only that the boy had stopped complaining about school, which Hutter appeared to consider the highest possible praise. The school grew. By the spring of 1877 there were 19 pupils, and the converted feed room was insufficient, and the town, which by this point had developed a community investment in Annie Rourke's educational efforts that bordered on the possessive, organized a building drive to put up a proper schoolhouse. Joseph contributed lumber. Cal Marsh contributed labor. Tom Garrett contributed both. Dale Hutter contributed money and looked uncomfortable about it, which was his standard response to generosity that might be interpreted as sentiment. The schoolhouse went up in April of 1877, with a real window on each side and a proper door, and a bell. Annie had specified the bell, as she had for the church, and no one had been inclined to argue with her. The cattle operation by this time numbered 51 head, which represented exactly what Joseph had told Annie it could be in 3 years when they had stood on the low rise in the fall of 1873, and he had said a small cattle operation on this land is a workable plan. He took a quiet satisfaction in this that he did not bother to hide. Annie pointed out correctly that his numbers had been conservative, and the operation had outpaced his estimate by 3 head. He conceded this with the grace of someone who does not mind being wrong when the correction is an improvement. They had by 1877 become what the panhandle called solid people, not rich, not powerful in any political sense, but trusted, dependable, the kind of people a community builds itself around, the kind that when you need something navigated or settled or explained, you go to them. Annie was the teacher, and by extension the center of a certain gravity in the town that had nothing to do with her holding any official position. Joseph was the man you could call upon when something needed to be built or fixed or done with honesty, and he always came. He had not entirely lost his private nature, but it had changed character. He still preferred fewer words to more, and still had no interest in being the loudest voice in any room. But the privacy was different now. It was not the privacy of a man keeping everyone at a distance. It was the privacy of a man who had everything he needed inside his own walls, and therefore had no hunger for the outside world's attention. A complete privacy, not a defended one. One evening in the fall of 1877, after the children were in bed, Joseph and Annie sat outside in the same place they had sat 3 years ago with their coffee, and the coyotes were going on the plain and the first stars were out, and it was entirely possible that if you had cut him open at that moment you would have found nothing in him but gratitude. "Do you remember the first evening we sat here?" she said. "Exactly," he said. "You were so careful," she said. "You were so careful not to let anything show." "I know," he said. "You were terrible at it," she said affectionately. He looked at her. The woman beside him was not precisely the woman who had stood in Harlan's general store in September of 1873. She was more than that, fuller, more certain of her place in things, carrying the weight and richness of everything that had been built in the years between. She was more beautiful, he thought, not because youth had anything to do with beauty, but because what a person becomes through living shows in their face, and what she had become was remarkable. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You've started several sentences that way," she said. "They usually turn out to contain something important. Are you happy?" he said. It was a simple question and it deserved a simple answer, and he asked it without decoration because that was how it mattered. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. He did not rush her. "Do you know what I thought about the whole trip from Illinois?" she said. "Before I came here, I thought about my mother's words. Home is not a place, it's a feeling. And I thought, I hope I find that. I hope wherever I'm going I find that." "Did you?" he said. She turned to look at him, and the amber eyes had everything in them. The years, the work, the children asleep inside, the cattle on the dark grass, the school with its bell, the small house that had become the exact shape of the life they had made, and him, and all of it together, and she said, "Every single day, Joseph. Every single day since I walked into that store and saw you walk in after me." He reached over and took her hand the same way he had that first night, her hand over his hand turning to hold hers, and they sat in the dark panhandle air with the stars coming out in their thousands, and the coyotes calling and the cattle quiet on the grass. And the life they had built was around them in every direction, solid as the earth. In the spring of 1878, Annie found out she was expecting again, and Joseph built a new room onto the house with a purpose and a speed that Cal Marsh found impressive and slightly alarming. And the new room was done before the summer heat set in, with a real wood plank floor and a window that caught the morning light. The child was born in November of 1878, a boy, healthy and noisy from his first breath. They named him Thomas Dale Rourke, for Tom Garrett and Dale Hutter both, and when they told the two men, Tom Garrett had to look at the ceiling for a long moment for reasons he described as dust in the eye, and Dale Hutter went so quiet that Joseph thought for a moment he had said something wrong, until Hutter took a very controlled breath and said, in his flattest voice, that it was a fine name for a boy who would amount to something. Earl, who was 4 years old and had been told he was getting a new brother, received this news with the philosophical equanimity of a child who has already worked out that the world does not generally consult him about its decisions. He examined Thomas with serious eyes and then went back to his breakfast, which Joseph considered a healthy response. Clara, at 2, was considerably more interested and had to be kept from attempting to pick Thomas up, which she was not yet structurally capable of but remained committed to. The Rourke family at the end of 1878 occupied the 160 acres of the Keating homestead and the additional 40 leased acres to the east, with 63 head of cattle managed by Joseph and Cal Marsh, with the school in full operation and 18 enrolled students, with 3 children growing in the small house that was no longer small. Joseph's freight days were fully behind him. Annie's seamstress days were behind her except for the occasional dress made as a favor to a friend. The land company and their frauds were behind them. The grief of Missouri was behind Joseph, not forgotten. He had learned that forgetting was neither possible nor necessary, but transformed into something he carried instead of something that carried him. What was ahead of them was the thing that mattered, which was everything still to come. Earl would grow up to know cattle as Hutter had predicted, and would also, unexpectedly, turn out to have his grandmother's love of books and his mother's gift for explaining things, which would eventually lead him to a career that surprised no one who had been paying attention. Clara would be a force of nature in every room she entered from the age of approximately 3 onward, and would become the kind of woman that her mother's example had made possible, a woman who knew what she deserved and did not lower the standard. Thomas would be gentle and steady, with his father's quietness and his mother's precision, and would turn out to have a gift with animals that even Dale Hutter would eventually remark upon without trying to suppress the obvious admiration. But this is what was certain and finished and closed and real. On a September afternoon in 1873 in a general store in Dusty Creek, Texas, a man with 2 rules walked in on a woman who was fighting for what was hers, and before supper of that same day, both rules were gone, and in their place was something that could not be made into a rule because it was too alive for that, too specific to this woman and this place, and this particular moment in which the world presented him with a choice that turned out not to be a choice at all. He had thought he was protecting himself with those rules. He understood later that he had only been waiting the way a field that has gone fallow waits, not dead, not finished, only resting until the season changes and it is time again. Annie Keating had changed the season. And on evenings when the panhandle sky went through its extraordinary performance of color above the grass, and the cattle were settled, and the children's voices came from inside the house, and the fire was lit, and the coffee made, and the woman he loved was somewhere in the warm interior of the life they had built on those evenings, Joseph Rourke knew with a completeness that left no room for doubt that this was the thing he had been made for, here, with her, on this ground, under this sky. Both rules gone before supper. The best decision he had ever had made for him.